The Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University.
To me, setting up the contract correctly is key, that having the right skills and the right collaborative culture. And the third thing for me is having the right tools. So use of digital software solutions, I think, would be a real enabler to ensure things are reported correctly and in a timely fashion.
Welcome to the Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo in partnership with the Open University. With me, Gerard, the Group Chief Executive of Pagabo. There are many challenges that face our sector, and today we're talking about contract management and supply chain. How we can use good management principles to ensure projects run efficiently, on time, and disputes are minimised. The Construction Playbook tells us we must embrace good contract management and good supply chain management to ensure that we get good outcomes. But what does that actually mean? How do we do it? And who needs to lead? Most contract disputes result from poor admin, poor management, poorly trained individuals in charge of projects and contracts. So how do we address this?
The Construction Playbook podcast with Pagabo.
So today, to help us go through these points, I have Stuart Kings, the Group Collaboration Director of the 55 Group and an author of the NEC4, and Tom Smith, the Group Commercial Director at ISG PLC. So I'm going to start on that first point, contract disputes. Stuart, what's your opinion about poor admin, poor management? Does that actually result in contract disputes?
Yeah, looking at research and case law, most construction disputes emanate from poor communication and poor paperwork and record keeping. I think one of the key things as well is people amend contracts, and often I've been involved in disputes where, with good intent, the legal profession have amended contracts, but those amendments have actually led to disputes themselves and caused more ambiguity. But certainly poor paperwork and record keeping certainly emanates in construction disputes.
And Tom, do you see the same at ISG?
Yeah, I think I'd echo obviously what was just said there, but I think for me, even where contracts are unamended and fairly vanilla, the issue really is the understanding of some of these mechanisms of the contracts and just poor training. So some of the root cause of this is down to people's ability and understanding.
Okay, so that's a really good perspective on that first point. So let's try and understand a little bit about what you believe good contract management could look like to actually deal with those disputes. Stuart, do you want to give us a flavour? I mean, in your history as one of the authors of NEC4, you've probably obviously academically seen a lot of this as well. So, how do you think good contract management could sit?
Yeah, I would echo Tom's point. I think to me, there's three separate strings. First of all, there's a setup of the correct contract. So people using the correct options within a contract, be that the NEC or JCT, or any other standard form of contract. And I think if the risk allocation is wrong, that will drive the parties into dispute and disagreement. The second thing really for me is the skills of the individuals, which is Tom's point. And principle number 4 of the Construction Playbook is all about people and governance and clients having the right skill set, not only to understand the contract and administer that day to day, but also to have a collaborative culture. And I've seen some excellent practice down at Hinkley Point C where they actually employed the commercial staff based on their traits, their personality traits, not only technical skills, but also their ability to work collaboratively. So to me, setting up the contract correctly is key, that having the right skills and the right collaborative culture. And the third thing for me personally is having the right tools. And the Construction Playbook recognises the use of digital first software solutions to manage contracts. Particularly, many would recognise the NEC suite of contracts to be quite admin intensive, and to manage those via Excel can be tortuous. So use of digital software solutions, I think, would be a real enabler to ensure things are reported correctly and in a timely fashion.
So, okay, we'll probably have a little section on the digital tools, actually, because I think that's a really interesting point you've made, Stuart. So, Tom, the training piece, I'm quite interested to know, say, from a contractor side and ISG specifically, what sort of training do you put your guys through and how does that work? And are they all trained?
Yes, I think I can speak from a practical point of view because we're living and breathing projects every day of the week. And I think when I look back at some of the successful projects that we've worked on in the public arena, I mean, certainly the Olympics as an example, early engagement was key on the Olympics, and our ability to really understand the contract, the risk allocation was key in the early engagement piece. But day to day in ISG, we're educating our people. Certainly when Stuart talks about NEC, that's a great contract that operated correctly, works fantastically. But of course you have to understand the core clauses and the mechanisms and how it works. So we have a suite of trainers that visit our offices, our projects, and really upskill our individuals on how to administrate it and really what it stands for. And I think it's not just our people, it's also our supply chain. And that is key because the understanding of the supply chain is normally pretty low.
Yeah.
You see a big difference between civils and structural subcontractors versus, let's say, fit-out type subcontractors who really, really don't understand the mechanisms. So I think training is really key, and if you're allowed that early engagement, and certainly the Olympics as an example, we were allowed to bring all our subcontractors in and educate them on how this thing should work, because it has to be with collaboration. Without it, you're going to lead to dispute.
Yeah. So do you enforce particular qualifications for them, or is it internal training or?
It's internal training. I think there's, in terms of qualifications, everyone's qualified. But I think, one of the points that, I firmly believe in is that, we go to university or to college and we all got accreditations. But actually, how much, project management, understanding of contracts and how they're operated do you really learn when you're doing a BSc or, an IOB or whatever it may be? It's very minimal. And I think that's where I think some of this root cause of the problem starts. It's education of a younger generation.
Yeah. So continual learning. I mean, we're hearing a lot about it at the moment as we come back out of the pandemic. I mean, there's a lot of sort of narrative now coming out of the government about sort of ongoing skills and training. So, okay, that's an interesting perspective then. So you mentioned something there which I thought was quite interesting, which was early contractor involvement, and that does link back to other chapters in the Construction Playbook. Stuart, what in your perspective then, what early contractor involvement? How do you see that?
To me, I see that as absolutely key. I mean, the Construction Playbook has highlighted some key issues within industry, but not forgetting earlier reports commissioned by UK government, the Egan report and Latham reports, they all endorse the same things. And we've recognised for a long time as an industry that early contractor involvement is absolutely vital, be that, as Tom highlighted there, through training and engagement with the supply chain, but also early engagement in design solutions. And from my perspective, I think as buildings become more complex and we strive for innovation and carbon neutrality, having the supply chain engaged early is absolutely vital. So completely endorse that. And I think modern frameworks and construction procurement methods should encourage that to get the most out of our industry.
Okay. So I'd be interested as a practical example of early contractor involvement, Tom. You're a contractor, just tell me how you see it. Are the clients actually following that? Do you push it? Do you sort of support it? How does it work with you?
Yeah, I mean, we endorse that, and I think we're working with the MOJ on an alliance currently where early contractor engagement is en masse. We've got an alliance of 4 main contractors and a whole raft of subcontractors involved in that process. So that alliance piece is a significant example, and I think that's a significant step forward as well. But we work on numerous frameworks in the public sector where we're bringing subcontractors in at a very early stage and are part of our tender process, and I think it's key. But as I say, working on the alliance currently, we're seeing that early contractor engagement really pushed very, very hard, and in a very collaborative way where contractors are sharing best practice and knowledge.
Is that a strategic outline business case, or is it a full business case? Is it just before you are engaged, or is it after you've been engaged?
This is after we've been engaged.
Right. Okay.
So that's quite a step forward, which is quite new. We don't see that in every situation, but certainly that alliance piece is very unusual and new.
So just with the clients actually then being encouraged to take early contractor engagement. Stuart, what do you see as the government's role in this? They've produced the Construction Playbook, they've released it, they did talk to the industry and a lot of people in industry, But, are they following their own playbook? Are there leads we can take from them, or what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting that the government consulted far and wide, looking at the Construction Playbook contributors, that there is significant contribution from industry. But I chaired an NHS conference recently, and we were talking about early contractor involvement and the criticality of that. Everybody in the audience was nodding their head. And I remember one of the top 20 contractors had the mic and said, completely endorsed what's being said, but the new hospital build programme has not allowed us to engage with healthcare trusts in England and have that early contractor involvement. So it does seem a little bit disparate. The government is saying one thing and not all of their procurement policies are following suit, if I dare be controversial. So I think there's probably a lack of consistency out there from the government clients. So more can be done, certainly.
Yeah, so do we think that's an education piece? Or, the approach with Construction Playbook is comply or explain, and there's a lot of stuff about modern methods in there, which we talk on a separate podcast. But what do you think, Tom? That's an interesting point Stuart's made. Are you seeing that as well, or have you encountered that?
Yeah, indeed. I think it's sporadic. So some, I'm not going to mention names if you don't mind, but I think some absolutely endorse it, which is fantastic. But there are parts of government that are not following it, and despite us gently reminding them that they're not following it, they accept they're not following it. And there's certain things, I wouldn't say early engagement so much, but certainly around risk allocation, that certainly is sporadic. And there are still some very unfair terms out there in the public sector. So I think it is sporadic, but there are absolutely people endorsing it for sure.
Just tying in with that, Tom, one thing that was aired at this conference was the perception that contractors are builders. From my experience, the contracting fraternity is a lot more complex and intelligent than that. And when we engage with contractors early on, for example, healthcare projects, I've seen clinicians as part of the supply chain, healthcare planners, architects, M&E designers. So I think there's often a perception that contractors are a builder and take a brief and build. But a lot of contractors out there are much more intelligent and have a whole supply chain, not just the construction supply chain, but the consultancy supply chain as well. And perhaps overcoming that perception is key.
I suppose the point I'm taking from this is we're on a journey, and it's not a destination, the Construction Playbook. And I think that's really what we hope we can see from clients. Obviously, another theme in the Construction Playbook is social value, and it's particularly big at the moment. As we move out of COVID and the pandemic, there's a lot more focus now on whole life costing and carbon. Do we think, they have a role in contract management? How do you try and embrace those 2 points, Tom, in the contract management approach?
Yeah, I think social value is a big thing currently, and we're seeing it, the importance of it, more and more. So, absolutely within projects, within our offering, social value is climbing up the ladder significantly. If I'm honest, I think it's social value is perhaps not fully understood by everybody, really what it stands for. And in terms of the construction management piece, there's definitely, again, I think a lack of understanding and a lack of skill in the industry, because I think it's something still that's relatively new to the industry and to the supply chain.
Yeah, so training again. So that's probably bringing in. So you can look at all aspects of the Construction Playbook there: digitization, digital tools, training, innovation. So that's good. Okay, it's Stuart. Are you seeing, as an author of the NEC4, or one of the contributing authors, carbon and secondary options? How does that work?
Yeah, it's just interesting going back on the previous discussion, because within NEC4 we have X22, which is a secondary option which covers early contractor involvement. So I suppose the NEC4 drafters have recognised that best practice is around early contractor involvement, and that ties in with the Construction Playbook. So that facility is there in NEC4. Whole life costing, as it's called, is a secondary option as well. That's X21. But it's what we would call a shell clause, in that it's got a set of clauses that people could, if they wanted to, engage with and start looking at whole life carbon reductions, which would in turn have an effect on the carbon footprint. The two are linked. But what it doesn't do is provide the drive and the skill set to look at whole life costing. So I think it's correct that the Construction Playbook has picked up on this, but I do think we need a shift in focus. It's fine having clauses, but we need to have the drive to address that. But it's interesting that the point you just raised, Gerard, social value, that's not a secondary option in the NEC 4 suite of contracts. Maybe it should be. Maybe that will come in NEC 5. But I think it's such a critical area and complies with procurement regulations that it's something we should be addressing. So perhaps it should be a secondary option going forward.
Well, it's very important to us as a business, as you know, Stuart. We sort of work very closely using social value as part of our sort of procurement routes, and we even have our own tool now through Social Profit Calculator. It'd be interesting to see if you then, I don't know whether you'll be a contributing author on NEC 5 when that comes around, but that might be an area to actually look at. Let's just, we've mentioned a couple of times briefly, but I want to sort of dig a little deeper into supply chains really. Because again, the Construction Playbook talks a lot about supply chains and SMEs, making sure they're managed properly and professionally. Obviously, payment is one, but managing risk is obviously another. So that probably falls a little bit in line with what you said, Tom, because I guess the risk allocation you receive at the client is passed through the contract. So with supply chains, you mentioned training with them, but are there any other points you think that are important to talk about with how you manage your supply chains through this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing, if we're talking about administrating NEC, for instance, I think the recognition sometimes that small, medium businesses, how they operate under those suite of contracts is fairly difficult. We can talk about NEC on huge health schemes, and there's probably a lot of success there. But if you talk about the NEC contract, for instance, on a smaller public project, it becomes very administration heavy for supply chain to administrate the core clauses and the secondary options, as Stuart said, well. And I think with the supply chain, what we have to do to assist them is critical. And in respect to risk, as you said, Gerard, pushing big risks down to suppliers just doesn't wash. So the ability for us to negotiate, an equal and fair risk allocation with employers is critical. Otherwise, the contractor and the supply chain find it very difficult to operate. But in terms of the suppliers, I think there's a lack of recognition of how they actually can operate under these what can be very complex arrangements.
Yeah, so I mean, the training point you made earlier actually was very relevant because, and it was interesting the point you made about some of the fit-out companies maybe supplying furniture or products like that. They wouldn't necessarily be au fait with good contract management. They'll probably be au fait with project management, which is actually different to contract management. So I think they're points well made. Stuart, is there anything specific in NEC about supply chain?
To me, those discussions boil down to possibly a lack of understanding of the suite of contracts for the contracting colleagues, or just kind of, there's often an approach of copy and paste the head contract and then pass that down the supply chain. But in terms of the fit-out contracts, there are supply-only contracts rather than a works contract. And there's also, within the suite, what are called the short contracts for subcontractors, consultants and supply only. And the short contracts are much more simple to administer. I mean, I've personally done training on High Speed 2, which I would see as a good showcase of this. And we had top-tier contractors at the head of the supply chain, but we did some briefings to local fencing companies, literally putting post holes in the ground. And we introduced the short contracts, which are very, very simple to administer, and just highlighted a couple of things really to them. If you want extra money, that's called a compensation event. You've got to notify it in a timely fashion. And if there's a problem with delivery, we call it an early warning. So just flag key issues and problems that you may have. And so I think for me, the suite of contracts offers an appropriate array to meet the skill set. But what we're not doing as an industry is getting down to the supply chain and engaging with them enough. As Tom said, on the larger projects, we invest in that. But I think on the smaller projects, we probably didn't do enough. And that should be led by the client, I think. They should be as a good client, they should be ensuring that that goes through the supply chain.
So what you're saying, the tools are there, it's about applying them.
I think it is. The tools are there. It's applying in an appropriate way. But I totally agree with Tom. If we just pass the risk down the supply chain, sometimes we get away with it, and other times the supply chain will fail and it just backfires on the contractor and client. But appropriate risk allocation is key.
Yeah. I remember the old building schools for the future days where a lot of the risk was trying to put the risk down to the person who was last through the door on what were significant schemes, some of them hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. So I think that's valid, and it's good to see that that's being addressed in the Construction Playbook. One of the things I just wanted to ask specifically about is project bank accounts and open book costing. I mean, are they used properly? Do they help? Tom, do you use them at ISG?
Well, we do. We use them a lot, or it's becoming more popular. I think they're very seldomly used correctly, if I'm being blunt, in the sense of really what they're there for. We have seen them operated correctly, but again, to Stuart's point, he talked about high speed 2. We're not involved in high speed 2, but the Olympics was probably an equivalent to something like that, and the scale of it, and it was operated correctly there. But it comes back to the point of the scale of a project. Ordinarily you get a project of those scales, and things are operated correctly and as they should be in terms of bank accounts. And then in other situations they're there because people think it's a good idea. And they're not used correctly. But in terms of open book costing, absolutely we see that work. But again, I think it's about the understanding and about really what it stands for and what people want out of it. In situations where you've got these huge projects and it's administration heavy and there's plenty of administrators around, it works perfectly. If you've got smaller projects where it's administration heavy and it's low people on the ground, it simply doesn't work properly. So I think it's absolutely, the situation is key, and where these things are chosen to be used is, fundamentally whether it will pass or fail.
I mean, your point there is leading me into my next area, actually.
Okay.
Because you meant, only because you talk about admin heavy and you talk about lots of administration. So one of the areas or the tools that could address that would be digital tools. We have a product at Cypro called Contract Manager, which Stuart has been involved in from its inception. So that heavy lifting, that digital tool. So I mean, really, the Construction Playbook does mention innovation and using technology. So our technology platforms are widely used, Stuart, in contract management. I mean, you've done a lot of training and support. Can technology help, and how does it help? What's it really good for? Does it address Tom's points?
Yeah, just backtracking a little bit on the project bank accounts. I dare to be controversial here because I'm not a great believer in project bank accounts. Firstly, they're a pain to set up. It's bad enough setting up your own personal bank account with all the checks and balances. And secondly, I think it's a lack of trust. It's almost like clients don't trust contractors. But you look at the top contractors in the UK, they pay their supply chain pretty well. And I've worked for them directly. They've often paid in 7 or 14 days because they recognise the criticality of a happy supply chain. If the objective of a project bank account is to ensure that the supply chain are paid on time, then it's a real misnomer. Why not use one of the open book options? Option C is very popular. And the contractor can only claim for the money if they can prove that they intend to pay the supply chain before the next assessment period. And that can be audited. So we can then assure ourselves as a client that they are going to be paid on time. So project bank accounts, to me, pain in the backside, suggest a lack of trust. And the vehicles are there if you just explore other main options, which are a lot less admin intensive. But in terms of the question about use of technology, as an industry, when I first started, we didn't use technology. Everything was Excel spreadsheets, and a lot of people, still rely on that. But as an industry, we have, I think, really embraced cloud technology and software as a solution. One thing we've got within the group of companies is Cypro Contract Manager, which we've used on lots of different contracts around the world in different sectors. And that does manage all of the heavy lifting and provides reporting on some quite complex areas of the contract, such as compensation events, and provide updates on deadlines and reporting and where people are up to. So I think as an industry, we have embraced that. And, going forward, use of technology is absolutely key.
I'll bring Tom in, but I just want to be a little bit controversial because our industry, is second only to fishing, is probably the least innovative industry in the UK, actually. And it's £100 billion a year. It employs nearly 3 million people and 300,000 companies. So it's, we do have a way to go to put digital at the core of what we do in terms of decision making and have it that data driven sort of environment. How do you approach this, Tom, at ISG? I mean, are you using more technology now?
We are indeed, yeah. And I think we're not using Cypro, but what Stuart just alluded to.
Not yet, obviously. Yeah.
Not yet, obviously, yeah. Maybe after this call, but certainly, when you're talking about a good example there, Stuart was saying about compensation events, and that is one of the biggest things that you need to get right. Certainly in an NEC platform. And likewise with early warnings. So yes, I recognise the Excel spreadsheets and trying to work out when we were time barred and when the need for reply was, and that can be very tricky without software. So as a business, ISG, but I think as an industry as well, the need for digital is absolute. Our business is embracing it. I believe they are. I've seen a massive shift in the last 2 to 3 years and the use of digital and the want for people to use digital. And of course, the generation that's coming through wants to be digital. The older generation might not want it to be digital, but certainly there's an absolute want from the new professionals in our industry to use digital. So I think it's just a matter of time before we do use digital in every walk of project management. So I think it's coming for sure, Gerard.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, the world is a lot more competitive now in terms of attracting new people, retaining them. And employees have got big choices now. And if they, as you've identified, young people they're natives, aren't they, with a lot of this technology? So, so as an industry, we do need to make it appealing for people to be able to express ideas, be innovative, whether that's small companies coming in or individuals inside business. I mean, I know a lot of contractors now are actually employing digital people, digital leads, expertise, teams of people. We have at Pagabo for nearly 2 years now, we've been focused on what we call the future of construction. And I've noticed actually some of our competitors are now employing people to take digital. So it's great, really, because I think the whole approach on innovation technology is something the industry should do, and we should work on that together. We've had a great discussion. I always finish off with these with just a final question to both of you. And it's really about what is your top tip that you think our listeners need to consider, whether they're a client or a user of the Construction Playbook, or even a contractor, or even possibly a supply chain. What do you think they need to consider? So I'll ask Stuart first.
Yeah, I think just backtracking this slightly, the Construction Playbook is a great refresh. It really shakes up the industry, makes us think. There's a lot of stuff in there that is a repeat of previous government reports, things like early contractor involvement, improving specifications, which is policy number 3. Banwell in 1964, which is 55 years ago, said that the construction industry could improve the briefing process. So we haven't really moved on a lot since then. So some of it's repeat, some of it's a little bit of a misnomer, I think, with the likes of the project bank accounts. But I think the key area to embrace is the use of digital platforms, as was just highlighted then, to attract young individuals to our industry, to make it attractive to work to and work within. And certainly if I was entering employment in the construction industry now, I'd want to work for a company that embraced technology, that was at the forefront, rather than a traditional company that wasn't embracing technology. So I think, for me personally, the top tip would be embrace technology wherever you can and make it an exciting place to work. Okay, so that's a great top tip. Tom, you probably have to have a different one, I'm afraid.
I do. I don't dispute at all. I mean, what Stuart just said, and us as a business, that's in the forefront of everything we do. I think my top tip for employers, I think, is simplicity in the agreements that they want people to operate under. And the fairness point, I think it's the risk allocation and how it's best managed and who best manages it. And that's obviously a big thing in the playbook also. So for me, simplicity in agreements and the fairness point, I think they're the things that I believe the industry is still struggling to embrace, and that will bring its own collaboration with it.
So that's a bit of a shout out there too, particularly to the client. So simple contracts, don't amend them too much. Be fair in your risk allocation, and then follow that up with Stuart's top tip. You can use digital, and then we've got a great sector, haven't we? Really, that's probably where we want to try and be. So, look, that's been fantastic today. I've really enjoyed today's conversation, and I suppose it just allows me to now say thank you very much for listening to this, and thank you to my guest Stuart Kings, the Group Collaboration Director at 55 Group, and also at Cypro, and also author. I'm just wondering if people email you, Stuart, will you still have some of those copies of your book, and you can sign them for them, I guess?
I've got tons of them. I've got a cupboard full of them. No problem with that.
You've got a cupboard full of them, so we'll have to get them out. And also to my equally interesting guest, Tom Smith, the Group Commercial Director of ISG. Fantastic discussion. Thank you both, and we'll see you again soon.